The wind came first, a sharp current from the Bering Sea that scoured the edges of Nome and carved its frozen streets into glass. Then came the silence, the kind that only deep Arctic winters could create. The town sat motionless under a curtain of white, its wooden storefronts and shuttered windows buried beneath months of snow that refused to melt. In the dim light of late January 1925, the frontier settlement was little more than a cluster of lanterns flickering at the edge of the world. Inside the small hospital at the corner of Front Street, Dr. Curtis Welch stood beside a trembling lamp, his breath clouding in the cold air. Before him lay a child gasping for air, her neck swollen from the grey film of diphtheria tightening around her throat. The doctor's gloved hands shook as he reached for his last vial of serum. It was nearly empty. Beyond the wooden walls, the wind howled like something alive. For days, Welch had pleaded for help through the telegraph lines that connected Nome to the rest of Alaska. Messages travelled through blizzards and broken cables, their words freezing mid-transmission. When the reply finally came, it brought both hope and despair. The nearest supply of diphtheria antitoxin was in Anchorage, nearly 700 miles away, across a landlocked sea of ice. No ship could cut through the frozen Norton Sound. The small propeller planes of the era, still fragile creations of the new age, could not fly in the temperatures that turned oil to sludge and metal to glass. Nome was trapped, and winter was merciless. Families crowded around stoves, burning the last of their firewood. Sled dogs howled restlessly in their kennels, sensing unease in the humans who fed them less each day. Above the town, the northern lights shimmered faintly through the storm, offering a beauty that felt cruel in its indifference. Rumours spread faster than the wind. Some said the ice would thaw in weeks. Others whispered of quarantine, of burning the bodies before the infection spread through the villages of the Seward Peninsula. By the third week of January, the children's graves behind the Lutheran church were buried in snow so deep the markers had vanished. Dr. Welch stood at his window that night and watched the storm bury the horizon. He knew the truth no one wanted to say aloud. Nome would not survive another month unless the serum could reach them. And to reach them, someone would have to cross the frozen heart of Alaska itself. By the end of January 1925, Nome had become a town suspended between fear and frost. The diphtheria outbreak was no longer a rumor whispered in the corners of the trading post. It was a reality pressing on every breath, a quiet terror that moved through the narrow streets like the northern wind. The disease struck first at the children, tightening their throats and stealing their air. Then it came for the elders. Within days, entire families were shut inside their cabins, the glow of lanterns behind the windows dimming one by one. Dr. Curtis Welch sent telegram after telegram pleading for assistance. His messages reached the territorial governor in Juneau, then the Public Health Service in Washington. The replies returned with the same line of hopeless truth. The antitoxin serum was in Anchorage, nearly 700 miles away, locked behind an Arctic wasteland that no vehicle could cross. The steamship Alameda, which usually carried freight along the coast, had been trapped by sea ice since early December. The new open-cockpit airplanes stationed in Fairbanks were useless, their engines brittle from the cold. Flying in temperatures below -50 Fahrenheit would mean certain death. Nome was unreachable by any modern means. The year might as well have been the 1800s. Word spread to the nearby settlements along the Seward Peninsula. Villages of Inupiat families sent dog teams into the storm to deliver letters and prayers. Some left food at the outskirts of town, too afraid to approach the infected. The silence of isolation grew heavier. In a single week, 4 more children were buried in the frozen ground, their graves marked only by sticks and scraps of fabric that fluttered weakly against the wind. Yet even in the heart of despair, the people refused to surrender. The schoolhouse stayed open as long as the teacher could stand the cold, and a few men kept the telegraph office running day and night. It was there, in that wooden building where frost crept across the instruments, that the idea was born. If no ship could reach Nome by sea, and no plane could fly above the storm, then the only path left was over the land itself. The Iditarod Trail, carved by gold miners years before, still wound through the wilderness between Anchorage and Nome. It was treacherous, steep, and buried under endless snow. But for those who had grown up behind sleds, it was familiar ground. A message was sent to the mushers across Alaska. The world would soon call it the Great Race of Mercy. For Nome, it was simply a race for survival. The plan formed out of desperation. When the telegraph lines hummed with the governor's final order, it was clear that time had already begun to run out. The diphtheria serum would be sent from Anchorage to Nenana by train, and from there it would travel the rest of the way by sled. There were no other options. The entire fate of Nome, its men, women, and children, rested on a relay of dog teams crossing nearly 700 miles of frozen wilderness. Messages went out to the best mushers in the territory, men who knew the trails that snaked through the interior, who could read snow like a map and sense a storm before the clouds appeared. Many were mail carriers, others trappers, all of them bound by the same code that ruled the Arctic frontier. Once a sled was loaded, the cargo was sacred. It did not matter whether it was gold or medicine or the hope of a dying town. Leonhard Seppala was among the first to answer. Born in Norway and hardened by the Alaskan winters, he had spent years racing dog teams across terrain others would not dare to cross. His lead dog, Togo, was small for a Siberian husky, but the animal's eyes carried a ferocity that seemed to cut through snow itself. Seppala had raised him from a mischievous pup into one of the most skilled and intelligent sled dogs in the north. When word of the outbreak reached him, he did not hesitate. In the coastal town of Nome, Gunnar Kaasen prepared his own team. He was quiet, steady, and trusted by Seppala, though few knew his name beyond the mushing circuits. His dogs were strong and well-trained, led by a black husky named Balto. Balto had not been considered remarkable, not compared to Togo, but he had loyalty in his bones and a calmness that steadied the others. As the serum left Anchorage by train on the 27th of January, every settlement along the trail held its breath. Men repaired sleds, fed their dogs extra seal meat, and waited by lantern light. In the distance, wolves howled as the temperature plunged below -50. The relay would begin in Nenana, where the train would stop at the edge of civilization. From there, 20 mushers and 150 dogs would run in sequence through forests, across rivers, and over the deadly expanse of the Norton Sound. Each man would carry the serum as far as he could before handing it to the next. No one knew who would reach Nome alive. When Leonhard Seppala left the settlement of Shaktoolik with his team, the horizon was already vanishing under a veil of snow. It was late January of 1925, and the blizzard had begun its march across the Seward Peninsula. The serum had been carried through the first stretch of the relay without incident, but the worst part of the journey still lay ahead. Seppala and his lead dog, Togo, were tasked with the longest and most dangerous leg of the run. They would cross the frozen Norton Sound, a shifting sheet of sea ice where a single mistake meant certain death. Seppala's sled runners hissed across the hard-packed snow as the dogs pulled with steady rhythm. Frost crusted on their coats, and their breath came out as white clouds that vanished instantly in the wind. Behind them, the sound of the storm deepened, a low roar rising from the sea. Seppala tightened his parka and looked ahead. Togo was already scanning the distance, ears pricked, body tense, guiding the team as though the blizzard itself spoke to him. They had travelled nearly 200 miles before reaching the Sound. The temperature had fallen below -60, and even the air felt solid. Seppala could not see the horizon, only the faint blue glow of daylight struggling through the storm. He trusted Togo completely. The dog's instincts were his compass, sharper than any map or tool. When they reached the edge of the ice, Togo slowed and tested the ground, his paws pressing lightly against the frozen crust. The sea groaned beneath them. Halfway across, the ice began to crack. The team lurched as the sled dipped forward, the serum nearly slipping from its lashings. Seppala shouted, his voice lost in the gale. For a moment, the world tilted into chaos. Then Togo lunged forward, straining with a ferocity that tore through the wind. The line went taut, pulling the sled and Seppala back onto solid ice. The crack behind them widened and vanished into the darkness below. They pressed on through the night, guided only by instinct and the faint shimmer of the aurora. By dawn, Seppala's hands were frozen, his face cut raw by the wind. But when the storm cleared for a brief moment, he saw the coast of Golovin ahead. Togo lifted his head, tail stiff, eyes fixed on the trail. They had made it across the sound. The hardest miles were behind them, though both man and dog knew the race was far from over. By the time Leonhard Seppala reached the outpost of Golovin, the blizzard had swallowed the horizon. The dogs were near collapse, their paws bleeding from ice shards that cut through the crusted snow. Seppala's beard had frozen into a solid mask, each breath turning to frost before it left his mouth. The serum, still bound to the sled, was wrapped in furs and sealed in layers of canvas. Inside that bundle lay the fragile hope of an entire town. Togo stood at the front, his body trembling from exhaustion, yet his eyes alive with purpose. For more than 260 miles, he had led the team through mountains, across frozen rivers, and over the treacherous ice of the Norton Sound. No other dog had covered such distance in a single run. When Seppala finally passed the serum to the next musher, he laid a hand on Togo's neck and whispered words the wind immediately carried away. The dog's tail barely moved. He had no energy left for celebration. The next teams took the serum deeper into the storm. Men came and went like ghosts along the trail, their faces wrapped in fur, their eyes hollow with cold. Some drove through the night and never stopped moving. Others were forced to camp as the wind roared across the tundra, burying sleds in snowdrifts taller than a man. The temperature fell below -50. The sky disappeared. In the settlement of Bluff, more than 100 miles west, Gunnar Kaasen prepared his own team for the final stretch. News of the storm had reached him, but there was no time to wait. Every hour meant another life fading in Nome. He fed his dogs by lantern light, checked the harnesses, and studied the ice along the trail. Balto, his black Siberian husky, stood quietly at the lead position. He was not considered the strongest of Kaasen's dogs, nor the fastest, but he was steady. When Kaasen called his name, the husky's ears lifted, and his gaze met his mushers with calm determination. As the relay moved closer to the finish, the land itself seemed to resist them. The wind carved new ridges into the snow, and frozen mist rolled off the sea, blinding every sense. In distant Nome, Dr. Curtis Welch kept watch at the hospital, counting the hours and praying the serum would come before the graves outnumbered the living. Across the endless white, the final handoff approached, and with it, a new name was about to enter history. The storm reached its peak on the first night of February, 1925. Winds tore across the Seward Peninsula with a force strong enough to lift snow from the ground and hurl it sideways. The trail between Bluff and Nome was no longer a path, but a living storm. Most men would have waited for the skies to clear, but Gunnar Kaasen knew that waiting meant death for those still breathing in Nome. He tightened his parka, whispered a quiet command, and the sled dogs leaned forward into the darkness. At the front of the team ran Balto, his black coat glistening with frost, his breath rising in sharp bursts. He was not the champion of Seppala's line, not the legend of races past, but tonight he carried a steadiness that no wind could shake. The gale howled across the frozen cliffs, throwing shards of ice that stung like needles. Kaasen bent low, face hidden behind his goggles, the reins stiff in his hands. The snow blinded him, and for long stretches of trail, he saw nothing at all. Balto guided the team by instinct alone. The world had vanished into white, and yet he found the track beneath his paws, as if reading a memory pressed into the earth. When the sled tipped against a buried ridge, Kaasen fought to keep his balance, clutching the small, precious bundle that held the serum. Inside that package was everything they had suffered for, everything Nome had prayed for. Hours passed in a blur of wind and shadow. The dogs slowed, their paws slipping on glare ice, their bodies shaking from exhaustion. Kaasen wanted to stop, but the storm's fury left no shelter. To pause meant freezing where they stood. He shouted again, voice breaking through the wind. Balto's ears flicked back. Then, with a sudden pull, the lead dog veered right, cutting through a corridor of snow that led down toward the frozen lagoon. He had found the way. As dawn neared, a faint light began to appear through the blizzard. The glow of Nome's lamps shimmered far ahead, small and distant like stars trapped in glass. Kaasen felt tears freeze against his cheeks. They had reached the edge of the town. Balto's legs trembled, his head low, but he did not stop until the sled crossed the final stretch of ice and came to rest outside the hospital. The run from Bluff to Nome had taken less than 6 hours, a miracle carved from snow and endurance. As Kaasen stumbled from the sled, Balto stood still, his breath shallow, his body caked in ice. The serum had arrived. Nome would live. When the sled finally stopped outside the small hospital on Front Street, the town was still asleep beneath a veil of snow. The only sounds were the creak of the runners and the faint whine of the dogs as they collapsed into the drifts. Gunnar Kaasen staggered toward the door, the serum clutched against his chest. His face was pale, eyelashes rimed with frost, and every step left a shallow imprint on the ice. Behind him, Balto remained upright, though his legs trembled violently. The black husky stood like a statue carved from the storm itself, refusing to fall until his duty was done. Inside, a nurse startled at the sight of the man bursting through the door. Dr. Curtis Welch rushed forward, taking the parcel with shaking hands. It was 5:30 in the morning, on the 2nd day of February, 1925. Within minutes, the serum was thawing beside a pot of boiling water. The doctor worked silently, measuring doses, calling for clean syringes. For the first time in weeks, there was something in his eyes other than exhaustion. It was hope. By dawn, the news spread through the town. Someone rang the church bell, and its sound rolled out over the frozen rooftops. Families emerged from their cabins, faces still ghostly with sleepless fear. They whispered the same name again and again, uncertain if it was real. The serum! It's here! Outside, Kaasen knelt beside his dogs, checking their paws and harnesses. The team had travelled more than 50 miles through the worst blizzard Alaska had seen in years. Several dogs had frostbite around their noses and pads, yet none had turned back. Balto leaned against the sled, his breath shallow but steady. When the doctor stepped outside to thank the musher, Kaasen only shook his head and gestured toward his lead dog. "Thank him," he said quietly. As the day broke, a pale sun rose over the Bering Sea, lighting the town in gold. The air smelled faintly of smoke and salt. In the hospital, the first injections were given, and by evening, the fever in the children began to subside. Parents wept in relief. Nome had been saved, not by ships or airplanes or the modern world's machines, but by men and animals bound together by instinct and faith. That night, the wind softened. For the first time in weeks, the storm withdrew toward the sea. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the gentle breathing of dogs asleep in the snow, their bodies curled close, their task complete. The story of the serum run reached the rest of the world within days. Telegrams flashed from Alaska to Seattle, then across the continent to New York. Newspapers carried the headline in bold letters, "Dog Team Saves Stricken Nome." For the first time in weeks, the icy wilderness of the far north was the center of the world's attention. Balto's name appeared on every front page. Children in warm American cities traced his photograph with their fingers and imagined the black husky running through storms that no human could face. In Cleveland, Chicago, and Boston, people spoke of him as if he were a mythical creature rather than a living animal. Toy companies produced miniature sled dogs, and newsreels showed Balto's calm, steady face beside his musher, Gunnar Kaasen. They called him the dog who saved Nome. When Kaasen returned to the United States with his team, he was met by reporters and parades. Crowds lined the streets, waving flags as the sled dogs trotted past. Flashbulbs burst like white lightning. Balto stood quietly beside his musher, blinking under the noise and the light. He did not understand the words shouted in his honor, but he felt the warmth of hands that reached out to touch him. To the world, he was now a symbol of courage and endurance, the perfect hero for a nation that had watched helplessly as an Arctic town fought for life. Far away, in the quieter town of Nome, Leonhard Seppala read the same headlines. He smiled faintly, proud of Kaasen and his dogs, but he knew the story that was not being told. His own team, led by Togo, had crossed more than 5 times the distance through the most dangerous terrain. It was their path across the Norton Sound that had made the relay possible at all. Yet in the rush to celebrate, few remembered the names that had carried the serum most of the way. Seppala never spoke with bitterness. He visited schools and small gatherings, telling children of the relay, and always mentioned Balto with respect. But in his heart, he knew that history often favored the one who finished, not the one who endured. In December of 1925, a bronze statue of Balto was unveiled in New York's Central Park. Snow drifted softly as the crowd applauded. On its base were carved the words, endurance, fidelity, intelligence. Balto stood beside it, quiet and calm, his dark eyes reflecting the winter light. He had become the face of a miracle. But the greatest miles of the journey still belonged to another. While crowds in distant cities cheered for Balto, the man who had crossed the heart of the storm returned quietly to his cabin outside Nome. Leonhard Seppala had never cared for fame. He cared for his dogs, the trail, and the unspoken bond that tied both together. After the great race of mercy ended, he brought Togo home to rest. The dog's paws were torn and bleeding, the pads nearly worn away by the miles they had conquered. He had covered more than 260 miles through mountains, frozen rivers, and the cracking expanse of the Norton Sound, a distance no other team had even attempted. Seppala tended to Togo like a wounded soldier. He fed him warm broth by hand, spoke softly to him in the language of the trail, and brushed the frost from his coat. The old husky lifted his head with effort, his eyes still bright, though his body trembled. Outside, the winter sun burned faintly on the horizon, turning the ice to glass. For the first time in weeks, the wind was calm. Over the following months, reporters arrived in Alaska to collect stories of the serum run. Most wanted to speak of Balto, the hero of the final dash into Nome. Few asked about Togo. The distance, the danger, and the unseen parts of the journey did not fit neatly into a headline. To the wider world, the story had already been written. Seppala did not argue. When he was asked to describe the run, he gave credit to every musher and every dog, saying only, "It was teamwork that saved Nome." But among those who knew the Arctic and the cruelty of its storms, the truth remained clear. They spoke of Togo as the greatest sled dog ever to set paw on snow. His endurance was unmatched, his instincts almost supernatural. He had crossed ice that even wolves avoided. In his later years, Seppala brought Togo to the state of Maine, where the dog lived out his final days surrounded by pine forests instead of the endless white of Alaska. When he passed away, Seppala preserved his body and sent it to the Museum of Natural History in New York, not for vanity but for remembrance. He wanted people to see the dog that had defied death for a town that never saw him arrive. Time moved on. The blizzard melted into legend. Yet among mushers, historians, and those who know the cold language of the Arctic wind, Togo's name remained a whisper of respect. He was the unseen hero, the one who ran farthest when no one was watching. Years passed, and the great race of mercy faded from the front pages of newspapers. Yet the trail between Nenana and Nome remained carved into Alaskan memory, like a frozen scar across the wilderness. Every winter, the winds that once tried to bury it seemed to carry whispers of the names that had conquered its storms. By the 1930s, dog mushing began to fade, as airplanes and snow machines took hold of the northern frontier. Progress had come to Alaska, but progress had a short memory. The dogs that had once carried letters, medicine, and hope were replaced by engines and steel. Still, in small villages, elders told the story of the year when the wind tried to kill an entire town and failed. In Nome, Balto's fame lingered. Children played near the hospital that had once been the epicenter of fear, their laughter echoing across streets that had once been lined with funeral markers. The bronze statue in Central Park stood thousands of miles away, glinting under the winter sun, visited by travelers who whispered his name with reverence. Few realized that the hero immortalized in metal was one of many, part of a greater story woven by men and dogs who had faced death together. Leonhard Seppala lived long enough to see the world remember his companion. Decades later, historians revisited the great race of mercy, poring over telegrams, weather reports, and journals. They found Seppala's records, written in careful, measured handwriting. In one of his entries, he had written, "No single dog, no single man could have done it alone." That truth became the heart of the legend. Modern mushers, inspired by the courage of those who came before them, began retracing the route each year in a race known as the Iditarod. They followed the same frozen paths through forests, across rivers, and over the haunting sweep of the Norton Sound. In every paw print pressed into the snow, there lingered the memory of Balto, of Togo, and of the men who refused to let fear decide the fate of their town. Though decades had passed since that fateful winter, the story endured because it was more than history. It was proof of endurance itself, of what loyalty and courage could achieve when the world turned cold. Somewhere beyond the reach of civilization, the wind still carried their names across the ice, a low murmur of gratitude from one generation to the next. And in that endless silence between snow and sea, the spirits of two dogs still ran side by side. Long after the heroes of the great race of mercy had vanished into history, the trail they conquered remained. Beneath the drifted snow and shifting ice, faint impressions still marked where sled runners once cut through the land. The storms returned each winter to erase them, yet somehow the path always seemed to reappear, as if the earth itself refused to forget. In Central Park, the statue of Balto still stands, his bronze fur brushed by the hands of children who know only a fraction of his story. In Alaska, Togo's preserved form rests in quiet dignity, his glass eyes glinting with the light of a memory too vast to fade. Together, they guard the legacy of a time when courage meant more than glory, when the will to endure mattered more than the praise that followed. Visitors come and go, taking photographs beneath the statue, unaware that somewhere, far to the northwest, the wind still carries the echo of sled bells and the faint howl of dogs. The story they represent is no longer about one hero or one race. It is about the bond that bridged man and animal, and the belief that survival was worth every mile of pain. Each winter, when the first flakes fall over the Yukon and the rivers freeze again, the trail awakens. Mushers set out on the 1,000-mile Iditarod, tracing the footsteps of those who ran before them. The same mountains rise, the same wind screams across the tundra, and for a fleeting moment, the world remembers. The town of Nome no longer fears the winter as it once did, but it still honors the night the medicine came through the storm. Somewhere beneath that sky, where the sea meets the ice, the spirits of Balto and Togo continue to run, side by side, across the endless white. Their tracks may vanish with the seasons, but their courage endures, eternal as the northern lights that burn above the frozen world.